Wabash. Our speaker today is an alumnus of the college. He was born and raised in Indianapolis, attended Wabash, lived at the Lambda House, and graduated in 1966. He then earned his PhD at Cornell and has taught medieval history at SUNY Geneseo near Rochester, New York for 38 years. He had a son graduate from Wabash in 2007, and tomorrow he will be heading to Italy with 16 students on an immersion trip. Please welcome Bill Cook for his chapel talk, Go Into the Chapel, and I'm Gonna.
In the middle of my undergraduate years at Wabash, a group called the Dixie Cups came out with a great hit song called The Chapel of Love. The first line goes something like this: go into the chapel and I'm gonna get married. Well, let me tell you, I've done just about everything in this chapel except get married. And that's what I want to talk about today. This chapel was dedicated in 1929 to the pioneers of Indiana, including those who, as we all know famously, knelt in the snow in 1832 and founded this great place. I suppose I walked in the chapel in some tour I took of Wabash when I was at Tech High School. But I first remember setting foot in this building on the 16th of September, 1962, for what was then Freshman Sunday. I was 18, and the chapel was only 14 years older than I was. And the featured speaker was President Byron K. Trippett. Now, I assume most of you have seen pictures of President Trippett. He was movie star handsome, Einstein smart, a Renaissance man, a man who comes closer to the Platonic notion of suave than anybody else I've ever met. Byron Trippett didn't need to say a word, although he said wonderful words. But ultimately what his speech said was to the parents, leave your sons here, and there's a chance they might become something like me. My parents were sold. They'd done as much as they could do. After all, they taught me how to dress properly. And the rest was up to Byron Trippett, class of 1930, and the Wabash faculty. That was a pretty good coming in. We were not rung in. That tradition had been lost and was only recovered in recent years. But I was at least metaphorically rung in this chapel, September 16th, 1962. I attended 3 other freshman Sunday chapels when I was here because I sang in the Glee Club, but I remember absolutely nothing about any of those. But I do remember freshman Saturday, 2003, 41 years after I had been a freshman. For my son Eric was sitting in the balcony, I was sitting below, and Andy Ford was speaking words I thought of great meaning and profundity that made me reflect not only on what Eric was going to experience, but what I had experienced. Andy Ford said, up to now, just about every decision that's been made in your life has been made for you. You may have had some contribution, but basically, perhaps even your choice of college was in some ways made for you. Beginning today, gentlemen, he said, you will be making your own decisions for the rest of your life. That this really is the first day of the rest of your life. And I thought about that both in reflection on my own time at Wabash and also with regard to watching my son grow. It wasn't always a steady growing curve in the 4 years that he lived in the basement of the Kappa Sig House in what I unfortunately referred to as the third world. Some of you may remember the old Kappa Sig House. But this building became the center of my life for the 4 years I was at Wabash, and in some ways, it has remained so. Let me tell you why. Let's start in the basement. Most of you probably don't have much experience with the basement of the Wabash College Chapel. I practically lived there. First of all, that's where the Glee Club rehearsed. That's where Bob Mitchum chomped in his cigar, swore at us, made us sing well, and we loved him and every minute of that. So I spent several hours every week simply in the basement rehearsing with the Glee Club. But the basement also had a classroom. It happened to be a big classroom, and therefore popular classes were held there. The first semester of my sophomore year, I took History 3. We had much less exalted numbers. Right now, that course is called History 221, and my guess is you don't learn any more in it now than I learned when it was History 3. No idea why they've added all these digits, but I assume it has something to do with computers and wickedness. But at any rate, I took History 3 in the basement of the chapel in the fall of 1963. And by the time I finished that course, I had made up my mind I was going to be a medieval historian. And by golly, I became one. So in some real ways, I found not just my profession, but my vocation in the basement of the Wabash College Chapel. So the chapel was a classroom and a rehearsal room. This part of the chapel was also the college's auditorium, for there was no Salter Hall. There was only Salter when I was here in 1962 to 66. He was a physics professor and one of the stalwarts of the Scarlet Inn. But let me tell you just some of the things that happened in chapel as auditorium. The Glee Club was part of making the first film about Wabash College. You got to go back and check this one out. Made in 1962. We had a Hollywood figure as the narrator, and the Glee Club recorded the background music here. I was a freshman. And we recorded the music, and we were really good. And the guy running the tape said, "We've got to do it all over again. There's a little bit of odd noise. We can't quite figure out what it is in the background." Unfortunately, they figured it out. I was playing with keys and coins in my pocket. This did not play well with Glee Club director Mitchum and the sophomores, juniors, and seniors who wanted to shoot this freshman. But we got it done, and the film, I hope, is somewhere in the archives where you can see how Wabash presented itself to the world for the first time on film in 1962. One of the great events that happened here the night before the DePaul game was Blue Key Stunt Night. Now, I know Blue Key Stunt Night's gone, so is Blue Key. I have no idea where they went, although I have a feeling that Blue Key Stunt Night went due to excessive obscenity. But when I was here, we were not obscene, we were merely clever. Each of the living units put on a skit in chapel that mocked DePaul. And I remember when I was a junior, I had one of the starring roles. Now, the Lambda Chis, you need to know this, after all, John Fisher was our advisor for many years, very classically oriented. So we reenacted a classical drama, and I played the role of a harpy, which meant that, among other things, I ran from the back up onto the stage, half naked, flapping black wings. It was one of my better nights, although not one of my more bizarre dress experiences in the Wabash College Chapel. Now, of course, for all of us back in my day, chapel meant first and foremost twice a week mandatory chapel on Mondays and Thursdays. Let me tell you how it worked. Freshmen sat in the balcony on numbered seats, and then the sophomores in the back and the juniors in the middle, and when you were a senior, you got front row seats. And one of the things you look forward to, one of the things that marked your progress at Wabash is where you sat in the chapel. And that was a wonderful thing. We didn't have formal ceremonies. It's just that when you came back in the fall, you got a new number and a new seat that was better than last year's seat. And since they were alphabetical, I got to sit just about where Steve is sitting in the second row, which meant I could actually, with my eyesight, see and hear things pretty well. And that was exciting. There were moments I wish I couldn't be seen, but most of the time, I was happy to be in the center of things. I did have a dream, however, because there was one place where students never sat, and that's up in the balcony, because that's where the faculty sat. And I dreamed someday that I would be in the Wabash faculty, and I would sit up there in faculty seating in the balcony. And so I arrive in August, and I'm ready to go up to the balcony and discover the faculty have become sophomores. I'm still getting over this. In fact, one day at chapel, I did sit up there just because, damn it, I wanted to sit in the faculty seating, even if there wasn't another faculty member anywhere. Well, another thing you need to know about the chapel is mandatory meant you were allowed 10 cuts a semester. On the 11th cut, you got an official letter saying goodbye for the semester from the dean. This was a serious problem because there were 30 chapels, and needless to say, many people got to 8 and 9 cuts by, the end of September. And therefore, this got to be difficult. Fraternity brothers and friends in the dorms were required by the sort of college culture to make sure that your buddy got up and didn't get his 10th cut, because the 10th cut was, again, only one away from disaster, and facing Norm Moore, the dean, over chapel cuts was not anything any sane human being looked forward to. Now, this could get pretty nasty at times, and I would guess there was even a little bit of cheating. Every now and then you'd see somebody sort of trying to lie down in his chapel seat, hopefully taking up the space also of the person next to him when the guys came by and checked to see who was here. But I remember one incident. There was a guy in Martindale Hall that had 10 cuts, and it was not the end of the semester, and his friends, I put the word in quotation marks, decided to play a trick on him. They bricked up his door. So at 12 seconds before chapel begins, he flings open his door and there's a brick wall. I sure wish they'd have taped that recording with Dean Moore. That would have been a fun one to listen in on. He got to stay, but it was not easy, and he would have plowed through the next brick wall rather than face another meeting with the dean of the students. Now, what actually happened in those mandatory chapels? Well, a variety of things. There were occasionally concerts and all kinds of things, but normally it was speakers like we have now. And some of those speakers came from outside the college. A few of those were truly memorable. We had Herb Philbrick, who was a commie, but he was also a spy for the FBI. And there was actually a TV series about him at the time that he was here. That was really sort of cool. He got up and sort of did your anti-commie, they're all dirty, rotten bastards rant, to which some of the faculty protested. It was a great day at Wabash. This is just like things are supposed to be. We had the Grand Mufti of Syria. I wasn't quite sure what a mufti was, let alone a grand one, but I learned. And that came in very handy because 2 years ago I was traveling through Turkey and met a mufti, and I knew what a mufti was. You never know where your liberal arts education is going to be valuable to you. We had former Secretary of State Dean Acheson come. He was the one who was in many ways the creator of post-World War II American foreign policy, and a very important guy. And I can remember him talking about those meetings with President Truman and the leaders of Europe after World War II. Sometimes it really is important to hear things from the people who have been there rather than simply to read about them, even if they wrote the books themselves. Usually, we had faculty talks. So we got to meet most of the faculty because, after all, there were 30 chapels a semester, and probably 20 of those were faculty talks. So over the course of several years, almost everybody spoke in chapel. I remember a lot of them, but I remember one in particular. My advisor, Jim Barnes. Many of you may know him. He's the professor you see with the seeing eye dog. He's a retired historian. He got up. Now, Jim Barnes, Harvard PhD, Rhodes Scholar, just, brains oozing out his ears. I'm really ready for some profound historical lesson. He did a reading of Baa Black Sheep, suggesting all of its socio-psychological and economic interpretations. It was wacky. It was brilliant. How I wish I could have done something like that. Occasionally, students spoke. That was always fun. When I was a senior, we had a student who stood here and said something like, "Gentlemen, we do a lot of talking to ourselves. We read a lot of books. We talk about them with one another. We relate them to Wabash. It's all very enclosed. Why, gentlemen," he said, "that's intellectual masturbation." That sort of sent a shockwave through the old student body, woke up a couple nappers, and sort of got the remaining hair on the heads of some faculty standing on end. It was an exciting moment, and intellectual masturbation was the topic du jour for several jours, as it turns out. Now, you need to know that while I was here, the bell was in Greencastle. The longest time the bell was away from Crawfordsville was from November 1956 to November 1965. So I was a senior, and the bell had never been on campus until after our victory in 2005 in Greencastle. Well, actually, it had been here a little bit before because we stole the damn thing. But that's another story. But on Monday in the chapel, the bell sat there. And our acting president, Butch Shearer, a Wabash man himself, and to say that he's a Wabash zealot is to put it way too mildly, just rang and rang and rang the bell, and we sat for glorious minutes just listening to the sonorous ring of the Monon bell. It was one of the most sensuous moments I've had in the chapel or any other building in my life. Now, there's one more thing you need to know about the chapel. You'll appreciate it because of what happened this week. On a particular chapel in April, comps grades were posted by name, because it was public, outside the chapel. And so as soon as that chapel ended, all the seniors, everybody else just stood away, rushed out there to see whether they were in fact going to graduate in June and with what kind of honors. And so all seniors remember that rush to the posted comps grades that were outside the chapel in their senior year. Now, ultimately, as a freshman, my fondest memories was with the exterior of the chapel. First of all, we had the chapel sing, which actually was on the steps of the chapel. And I'm happy to report on that issue, I never saw the inside of the chapel. I sang the song well, and by golly, 40 years later, when my class was back for Big Bash, we won the chapel sing. We were the only class that even dared to sing both verses. But also, as a freshman, I guarded this building against our enemy. I can remember marching around armed with all the tools of war, a rake, a shovel, stuff like that. And we guarded this building. So I have great memories of the exterior of this building as a freshman. But as a senior, I remember things that happened on the inside. The night before graduation, the Glee Club had its final concert here. And Bob Mitchum, the Glee Club director, singled each one of us seniors out and told stories, in some cases, stories we didn't quite want our parents to hear, about us and our 4 years. And that was a beautiful and wonderful time. It was a moment to celebrate the 4 years that began with me jingling my coins, included the first Wabash College Glee Club trip to Europe, and ended with this concert. And of course, at the end of that concert, we sang for the millionth time the alma mater. And then the next morning I was in here again for our baccalaureate service. And the speaker was, and still is, he's still alive, a great theologian, a guy from Chicago named Martin Marty. In my 4 years at Wabash, I've worn just about every kind of clothing in this building. I've worn my usual grubby Wabash stuff. My father once described Wabash as a training school for slobs. I've worn pajamas, as many of you have to class. I've worn my Glee Club blazer, my best suit, and in the part of a harpy, almost nothing. So I've really done just about everything here. I've had some of my most awake moments of my life in this chapel, and a few good snoozes. As I've come back to Wabash this year, I've had some other experiences. First of all, before I came back to teach, I had the experience of being inside for the baccalaureate service of my son in 2007, where I sat there and watched that he didn't fall asleep. Now that I'm back, because we have Mass here on Sunday afternoons from time to time, I actually worship in this chapel and have in fact prayed and received Eucharist. I've communicated, if you will, with Christ in this chapel. I've been here to say goodbye to two of our own, Johnny Smith, whom I never met, and who had just been a Wabash man for a few weeks, and my friend Bill Plaker, whom I'd met when he was a senior in high school and was one of our most wonderful and profoundly beloved alumni of this college. I was asked in the fall to give the invocation, to call God's blessing down on this college at the Alumni Chapel. So I've had an extraordinary range of experiences in this place. It is for me the heart of Wabash College. It is for me a sacred place. And yet it's a sacred place, not in the sense we might say the First Presbyterian Church or St. Bernard's is a sacred place. It's a place where the loud and the quiet have had their ways. It's a place of worship, and yet it's a place in a very special way in which some of the most profane things have happened. In other words, it's an incarnational space. It's a space where our humanity and that divinity that is a part of us are nourished, sometimes in what seems to be separate ways, but very often together. This chapel, a holy building in shape, but without any religious symbols on it, is a great reminder to me that we don't divide our lives into parts, but all of our parts are part of a whole. And more than any other place, you may have a different place at Wabash, but more than any other place, this place represents all of who I am, not just as a Wabash man, but as a human being. It is an incarnational place where body and soul are nurtured, where the human and the divine sparks come together and live together. Sometimes it seems they're separate, but in some ways there's something sacred about every profane thing that happened here, and there's something worldly about every spiritual thing that's happened here. After all, when Jesus comes to us on the altar, he doesn't come as a ghost, he comes as bread and wine, as material things. And so this is, with a small c, a Catholic place for me, a universal place for me, a holy place for me. And after all, a place like that is a fitting tribute to those pioneers from Indiana that came here and not only built this college, but built this society. They were men who knew how to wield an axe, and they were men who knew when it was time to kneel in the snow. And we are comfortable doing all those sorts of things in the Wabash College Chapel. This is their monument. This is my sacred place. It's what you see when you drive into campus. Gentlemen, treasure this as a sacred space, and always remember how this place represents to you your life and your life as a Wabash man. Thank you.